The wind over Kassel still carried the smell of burnt aluminum and oil. February 1944. Snow covered the fields where the wreckage of a B-17 had torn the earth apart. German recovery teams were used to seeing what they called fliegende Festungen, flying fortresses, broken like toys after the American daylight raids. But this one felt different. The nose section had survived almost intact, half buried in frost and silence. Among the twisted metal, a Luftwaffe engineer named Otto Weiss crouched, brushing away ash with his gloves, until he saw a pale rubber mask still hanging from the shattered cockpit harness. He lifted it carefully. The tube was crushed, the lens cracked, but something inside caught his attention. The inner rim wasn't harsh rubber as he expected. It was lined with something soft, fleece-like, made to rest gently against the pilot's skin. When he pulled the material apart, a small packet fell into his palm. A tiny heating cell, about the size of a coin, designed to keep air warm before it reached the lungs. Otto blinked, confused. It wasn't military, it was humane. The others gathered around him. Sergeant Kruger, a mechanic from Bremen, laughed bitterly. "We build iron masks," he said. "They build pillows." Another engineer, Lenz, rubbed the fleece between his fingers. "No wonder they fly so high," he muttered. "At 9 kilometers, they breathe warmth while our boys choke on frost." A few of them thought it was propaganda, some American trick to make their gear seem luxurious. But Otto knew better. He had designed fuel pumps for the Ju-88 bombers, and nothing in German design prioritized the comfort of a pilot. Efficiency, durability, speed, yes. Warmth, softness, ease, no. That was considered weakness. He examined the mask again, tracing the tiny air valves and the embossed initials, AAF, type A14B. Each component had been machined with care, every screw and stitch deliberate. "This wasn't built just to function," he said quietly. "It was built to protect a man's face." The others fell silent. In the distance, they heard Allied bombers droning toward another target. Overhead, white trails etched the frozen sky like handwriting from another civilization, one that had figured out how to make survival feel almost gentle. When the recovery truck arrived, Otto wrapped the mask in cloth, unwilling to toss it with the rest of the debris. That night in the workshop, he disassembled it piece by piece under the dim yellow light. The fleece was genuine wool, imported. The valves used precision bearings smaller than any in German supply. And there, inside the housing, he found the small heating pocket, powered by a chemical reaction, reusable up to 20 times. Kruger leaned over his shoulder. "It's absurd," he said, "to pamper men in war." Otto didn't answer. He was thinking about the American pilot who had worn it, maybe someone his age, 28, breathing calmly in sub-zero air, believing someone back home had cared enough to think about the warmth of his skin. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "They make steel, we make fear. They make comfort, we make endurance. But maybe comfort endures longer." Outside, snow kept falling over the wrecked field, covering the trail of the bomber as if to erase both victory and defeat, leaving only the question that would haunt them all. How could an enemy who designed softness fight so hard? If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is there. Morning light filtered through the windows of a requisitioned hangar near Göttingen. The captured fragments of the B-17 had been delivered for technical analysis under Luftwaffe supervision. On a long wooden table lay the pieces of the oxygen system, hoses, valves, and the curious mask that Otto Weiss had rescued from the snow. The air smelled of rubber, kerosene, and stale coffee. The engineers gathered in silence as Weiss placed the mask under a magnifying lens. Every rivet gleamed. Every line seemed drawn not just by necessity, but by intention. Then Kruger noticed a tiny inscription stamped along the inner rim, so small it was barely visible. He tilted the piece under the light and read aloud, "Approved by Army Air Forces, Comfort Division." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Lenz laughed in disbelief. "Comfort Division? They have an entire department for comfort?" His tone wavered between mockery and awe. Otto's brow furrowed. "In Germany, that word disappeared 5 years ago," he said softly. "Since 1939, we talk about sacrifice, efficiency, obedience, but never comfort. They wrote the phrase on the blackboard, Komfortabteilung. The word looked strange, almost subversive. One officer, Hauptmann Dietrich, frowned. Ridiculous. Only the Americans would waste resources pampering their men. War isn't a hotel. But Weiss felt a quiet rebellion inside him. He thought of the endless memos from Berlin, demanding more output with fewer materials, of engineers sent to the Eastern Front for questioning design standards that cost lives. He had once suggested adding padding to pilot harnesses to prevent spinal injuries. The proposal had been rejected as unnecessary softness. He turned back to the mask. Its components were clearly standardized for mass production, yet made with almost domestic care. The fleece lining was machine-sewn, not glued. Even the buckle had rounded edges so it wouldn't cut through gloves. This, he said, isn't waste. This is foresight. Outside the hangar, an air raid siren wailed in the distance. Another Allied formation crossing the Rhine. The men froze, instinctively glancing upward. For a brief instant, they imagined those American crews breathing through masks like this one, calm behind walls of heated air, guided by comfort even as they dropped destruction below. A clerk entered carrying a folder stamped Geheim. Inside was a translated intelligence report from a downed U.S. pilot interrogated weeks earlier. The document mentioned new procurement offices inside the U.S. Army Air Forces, labeled under Human Factors and Comfort Engineering. To the German analysts, it sounded absurd, until they read that the same department had improved bomber crew endurance by 38% in winter missions. Weiss put down the folder slowly. Numbers didn't lie. 38% more time in the air meant 38% more bombing runs completed. Comfort wasn't indulgence, it was strategy. Lenz muttered, "They make men last longer by making them feel better." No one laughed this time. The chalk squeaked across the board as Weiss wrote one sentence. In America, comfort serves the war. In Germany, men serve discomfort. When the lights flickered under the power cut that night, Weiss stayed behind. He touched the mask once more, tracing the tiny words, Comfort Division. They glowed faintly in the lamplight like a message from another world, one where compassion itself had become an instrument of war. Outside, the winter wind howled through the hangar's broken panels, whispering that perhaps the enemy's greatest weapon wasn't machinery at all, but empathy organized into production. The following week, the engineers were ordered to conduct destructive testing on the mass components for documentation. They worked inside a dimly lit maintenance depot, its walls blackened by smoke from recent raids. Otto Weiss steadied the oxygen hose on the table, its rubber glistening under the work lamp. Kruger sharpened a small utility knife, muttering, "Let's see how fragile American comfort really is." The first cut sliced clean through the surface, revealing multiple layers of polymer tubing. But when Weiss released the clamp and air hissed through, the incision sealed itself. The edges drew together, closing like a living wound. He leaned in, astonished. "Impossible," he whispered. Kruger repeated the test, cutting deeper. Again, under oxygen pressure, the material fused shut. The room fell silent except for the rhythmic hum of the compressor. Lenz, flipping through a captured technical sheet, found the composition code, neoprene latex compound, DuPont patent 1943. His voice faltered. They use chemistry to make self-healing rubber. In German industry, such materials were reserved for experimental aircraft, projects so secret that even senior engineers rarely saw them. Here, the Americans used it for something as mundane as breathing. Weiss stared at the hose, its wound now invisible, and murmured, "We call this a miracle. They call it standard." For the first time, the realization cut deeper than the knife. American industry had normalized innovation. What Germany reserved for prototypes, America built by the millions. Weiss knew the numbers. In 1943 alone, the United States produced over 40,000 B-17s and B-24s combined, while Germany struggled to complete barely 1,000 bombers of all types. It wasn't just quantity, it was philosophy. Every improvement, no matter how small, was shared, scaled, and humanized. Kruger slammed his notebook shut. "So they care more about hoses than we do about men." But his words lacked conviction. That night, as the engineers prepared their report, they argued in low tones. Dietrich insisted the Americans were decadent, wasting effort on luxury. Weiss countered, "No, they build resilience. Comfort extends endurance. A man who breathes easily fights longer." He He pointed to the sealed hose. They don't design to impress command. They design to protect crews. In a corner of the room, an old phonograph crackled with static. Someone had salvaged a record from a destroyed cafe, a jazz tune drifting softly through the air. It was foreign, irreverent, alive. The men listened without speaking. Outside, the night sky glowed red from distant fires, the city of Kassel still burning from the last raid. Weiss watched the flames through the window. He thought about those pilots, sitting thousands of meters above the chaos, trusting a mask like this one to keep them alive. The fleece, the valves, even the hose that healed itself, all symbols of a nation that understood survival as comfort, not punishment. He returned to his journal and wrote, "We measure strength by how much pain a man can bear. They measure it by how much he need not." When the generator died and the lights went out, the hose on the table still glowed faintly under the moonlight. Its seamless surface proof that somewhere across the ocean, another idea of civilization had already begun to breathe. The camp infirmary at Oberursel smelled faintly of antiseptic and cold metal. Rows of narrow beds filled the room, occupied by captured Allied airmen in various states of injury. Among them lay Lieutenant Charles Avery, a 25-year-old B-17 co-pilot from Michigan, his arm splinted and wrapped in linen. He breathed shallowly through a cracked lip, but managed a polite nod whenever someone passed. In one corner, a German nurse named Hilda Bauer tended quietly to wounds under the dim yellow bulbs that swung each time a train rumbled by. Hilda was not supposed to speak to prisoners beyond medical necessity, yet her curiosity often betrayed her discipline. When she approached Avery to change his bandages, she noticed something unusual beside his bed, a replacement oxygen mask from his flight gear, tagged and logged as medical aid material. She picked it up, studying its smooth, curved edges. Her hands trembled slightly. She had seen many masks from her own country's aircraft, sharp, heavy, awkward contraptions that often tore skin when removed in haste. But this one had a quick release latch. She pulled it experimentally, and with a soft click, the mask detached in a single motion. She stared at it, stunned. No struggle, no twist, no pain. When she turned back to Avery, she asked softly, "Why so easy to remove?" His answer came with a faint smile. "Because we want our medics to save us fast." Hilda froze. 5 years in military nursing had taught her to calculate survival through efficiency, not empathy. She had spent endless nights in field hospitals near Smolensk and Warsaw, improvising amputations with dull saws, racing time against blood loss. And here was an enemy who had designed not for killing faster, but for rescuing faster. She brought the mask later to the engineering hut, where Weiss and his team were compiling new findings. "Look," she said, demonstrating the latch. "One pull, 5 seconds." The men gathered, astonished. The mechanism was so simple, a small spring and pivot pin, yet none of them had ever proposed it for Luftwaffe design. "We spent 5 years learning how to destroy faster," Hilda said quietly, "and they spent 5 seconds learning how to save faster." For a moment, no one answered. Outside, snow melted from the roof in slow drops. The sound was unbearably gentle after her words. Weiss felt something inside him crack. Not pride, not shame, but fatigue. The exhaustion of realizing that perhaps their entire way of thinking had been built backward. He examined the latch again, holding it to the light. "They designed mercy into machinery," he murmured. Later that night, Hilda returned to the infirmary. Avery was awake, staring at the ceiling. She placed the mask beside him and said softly, "Your engineers, they understand people." He blinked, unsure if she meant it kindly or sorrowfully. She walked away before he could answer. Her eyes burned. Outside, the moon shone through broken glass panes, glinting off the metal latch she still held. Somewhere beyond the wire fences, another convoy rolled east. Inside the camp, for the first time in years, a German nurse cried not from fear or fatigue, but from realizing that compassion could be engineered. By late March 1944, Camp Oberursel had settled into its strange rhythm of quiet industry. The barracks smelled of tobacco, oil, and the faint sweetness of pencil shavings. Behind the wire, German engineers were permitted to write letters home under strict censorship. Most of them filled their pages with bland reassurances. Good health, steady work, patriotism rehearsed. But Otto Weiss hesitated over his sheet of paper for hours before he finally began to write. "Dearest Anna," he started, "today we studied something built for breathing, yet it feels as if it was built for believing." He wrote about the oxygen mask, the fleece lining, the quick-release latch, the mint-scented filter he could not forget. He described the moment when the word comfort division appeared before their eyes, and how it silenced the entire room. "They fight in warmth, my dear," he confessed, "and perhaps that warmth is what keeps them from going mad." The sensors never saw that line. The letter never left the camp. It was intercepted by American intelligence, translated, and quietly stored in a file labeled Psychological Observation, Attitude Shift in German POW engineers. The analyst noted that the tone was not admiration of enemy power, but of humanity, what they called moral reorientation. Inside the camp, Weiss began sharing his doubts with a younger engineer named Lenz, barely 24. "They don't build machines to prove superiority," he said one night. "They build them to keep men alive long enough to feel human." Lenz looked away. "We were told to build for victory," he said softly, "but maybe they built for return." In another corner of the barracks, Sergeant Kruger still refused to join these reflections. "You two sound like traitors," he growled. "Comfort doesn't win wars. Discipline does." Yet even he flinched when Weiss replied, "Then why are we the ones behind the wire?" As spring crept into the camp, sunlight fell longer through the barrack slats. The engineers continued their analyses, but something had changed in their tone. Their reports grew less mechanical, more contemplative. One entry read, "American design values the body, German design consumes it." Weiss folded his confiscated letter into his journal. He no longer wrote for Anna alone. He wrote for history, for the version of himself he wished had existed before this war began. He stared at the mask one last time before storage, tracing the curve of the fleece around the nosepiece. "They built for breath," he whispered. "We built for order." The silence that followed felt heavier than steel. And if you were there, standing behind that wire, watching an enemy's compassion unfold before your eyes, what would you have felt? Would you still cling to the pride of your side, or let humanity breach the fence? Tell me, viewers, would you rather fight in comfort for the wrong cause, or suffer for the right one? The wind blew through the camp that night, scattering ash from the stoves. Weiss dreamed not of victory, but of air, warm, weightless, and undeserved. April 1944. The sky above Camp Oberursel had turned the color of wet tin. A transport truck arrived carrying several crates marked AAF equipment for technical evaluation. Inside were more fragments of American flight gear, gloves, jackets, helmets, and another set of oxygen masks, clean, untouched, smelling faintly of mint and rubber. The guards allowed Weiss's engineering group to inspect them under supervision. The crates were opened in the workshop where a pot-bellied stove crackled, the only source of warmth. The engineers stood around the table as if attending a quiet ceremony. Weiss picked up one of the masks. Its surface still held the faint imprint of a pilot's face, the wool lining soft like new snow. At first, no one spoke. Then Lenz reached for it, hesitating before pressing it lightly against his nose. His breath fogged the glass lens above the cheek pad. "It fits," he whispered, as if it remembers someone. They began testing the airflow through the hose. When they connected it to a small compressor, oxygen hissed out clean and steady. The sensation shocked them. The air was warm, almost soothing. In that single breath, something shifted. For months, they had analyzed this object as engineers. Now they felt it as men. One by one, they tried it. Each time, the reaction was the same. Eyes closing, shoulders relaxing, a brief silence heavier than any confession. Kruger, once the loudest skeptic, placed the mask over his mouth and inhaled deeply. His expression changed from suspicion to something close to sorrow. He set it down and walked outside without a word. Hilda, the nurse, happened to pass by the workshop. Seeing the scene through the open door, grown men standing motionless, heads bowed, the mask lying at the center of the table, she understood without hearing a word. The war was losing its language inside them. That night, the barracks fell unnaturally still. No arguments, no patriotic songs, no talk of machines. Only the low hum of wind against the tin roof. Weiss sat by the small window, writing his final report. The pen scratched slowly. Comfort breaks hatred. Once a man has breathed through mercy, he cannot return to cruelty. He stared at the page, unsure whether to send it to his superiors. Instead, he folded it into his journal with the confiscated letter. He knew the words would never leave this place, but perhaps one day, someone would read them and understand what kind of war they had truly lost. Outside, Hilda stood near the fence, watching the searchlights sweep across the snow. The world was still divided by wire, yet something invisible had already crossed over. And you, watching now, if you were given the chance to see such humanity from your enemy, could you still hate them? Could you breathe the same air and still wish them dead? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if mercy came disguised as a mask? The war ended, but its memories refused to die. By 1955, the world had split again. This time, not by trenches or barbed wire, but by ideologies colder than the ruins they replaced. Otto Weiss, now a quiet engineer for a civilian firm in Hamburg, avoided speaking of the past. His colleagues knew him as the man who never raised his voice, who always insisted that machines must serve people, not command them. See, but those words had a root buried in a winter 3 wars ago beneath a field outside Kassel. That year, an invitation arrived from the United States. The Smithsonian Institution was opening a new aviation exhibit, and former engineers from both sides had been asked to attend. Weiss hesitated for weeks before accepting. He crossed the Atlantic aboard a Pan Am clipper, the same ocean his generation once tried to dominate with bombs. On a bright Washington morning, he stepped into the museum's hangar. The air smelled faintly of wax and iron, and above him hung the reconstructed fuselage of a B-17 flying fortress. Children pressed their faces to the glass displays, pointing at artifacts labeled with dates and serial numbers. Weiss walked slowly along the rows until he stopped before a small case of oxygen equipment. Inside, perfectly preserved, lay the mask. Fleece-lined, mint-scented, the same design he had held in his trembling hands 12 years earlier. The placard read, Type A 14B oxygen mask, United States Army Air Forces, 1943. He felt a pressure in his chest. Around him, visitors murmured, cameras clicked, but the sound faded into a soft, distant hum. He leaned closer to the glass and saw his own reflection merge with the shape of the mask. In that moment, the faces of the men he had known, Kruger, Lenz, Hilda, seemed to stand behind him, silent witnesses to the object that had changed them all. He whispered, this wasn't a weapon, it was a lesson. A museum guide, noticing the old man's stillness, approached and asked in English, "Were you a pilot, sir?" Weiss shook his head. "No," he replied gently. "I was an engineer who learned how to breathe too late." He stood there for a long time, watching a young boy point at the heating cell embedded near the valve. The boy's father explained, "It kept the air warm so their lungs wouldn't freeze." The child nodded, wide-eyed. Weiss smiled faintly. Perhaps that was how civilizations healed, not through victory, but through the memory of how carefully they once built for breath. When he finally left the museum, rain had begun to fall. It struck the pavement softly, like snow melting from another lifetime. He paused, breathing deeply, feeling the air, mild, clean, alive. For the first time in decades, he felt the simple grace of inhaling without guilt. And as he walked into the gray afternoon, the words from his old report returned to him. This mask is not a weapon, but it wins wars. Not wars of nations, but of souls. Years later, long after Otto Weiss was gone, a curator at the Smithsonian found a small envelope tucked behind an old technical manual in the museum's archives. Inside was a faded page written in careful German script. When we built for death, we forgot how to breathe. When they built for life, they forgot no one. It was unsigned, but the handwriting matched the old visitor log from 1955. Someone had left behind a confession disguised as history. The B-17 oxygen mask still rests behind glass today, its fleece long yellowed with age, its rubber hardened by time. School children lean close to it without knowing that somewhere inside that mask lies the memory of a generation who discovered that compassion could be engineered. Every valve, every strap, every tiny heating cell tells a story, not just of technology, but of priorities. Of a nation that believed survival should never come at the cost of comfort, and another that believed discomfort was proof of strength. And yet, when those German engineers disassembled the mask in that freezing workshop, they dismantled something far larger than a piece of equipment. They dismantled the illusion that progress and mercy were opposites. They learned, piece by piece, that empathy was not weakness, but endurance in disguise. Otto's words, scribbled into his notebook by candlelight, still echo across the decades. Comfort breaks hatred. It's a line that belongs not only to him, but to every generation forced to choose between efficiency and humanity. If you ever stand before that same glass case, look closely. Behind the straps and valves, you might see your own reflection, because the question the war left behind is still the same. When the world hardens again, will we remember to design for breath, for warmth, for one another? And maybe, in that quiet pause between questions, you'll feel it too. The hum of air through invisible tubes, a sound that once kept men alive in the thin, cold sky.